This galaxy ain't big enough for the two of us. Well, it is precisely, which is why it does so well for creating so much endless fun and enjoyment for us all. I'm not talking about our galaxy, I'm talking about a galaxy far, far away. It's a galaxy that has ignited childhoods, adulthoods, and hell, anything with a fuse like no other, with its sense of wonder and exploration, focus on adventuring, working together, and, well, lightsabers. Yeah, you're guessing it, finally. We're talking about Star Wars, my favorite fictional universe, and has been since I fell in love with the KOTOR series, which in turn made me a far bigger Star Wars fan of all sorts of media, including the books, games, and of course the iconic well-known movies that started it all. No matter how mixed of a bag that is, let's be honest. So when a new Star Wars game comes out or is announced, I'm always willing to at least give the game a shot, especially when it presents a unique premise of playing as a scoundrel, doing scoundrel things, my favorite, something we don't get a lot of experience with in the Star Wars universe, besides with the KOTOR series, ironically, and of course like games like Bounty Hunter. So a chance to play as one, K-Vess, and fly a ship known as the Trailblazer around the galaxy getting into different kinds of trouble sounded very tantalizing for me. With the upcoming announced at the time, Star Wars Outlaws, set to be an open-world adventure game developed by Ubisoft, or Massive, behind The Division, allowing you to explore a set of planets you can adventure through with your crew in an attempt to get riches and explore the galaxy. Ubisoft would drop Star Wars Outlaws in the fall of 2024, and although the game had a reported 600 plus developers from over 11 different studios working on the game would fail to impress critics and fans alike, ultimately falling short of Ubisoft's target sales, which would result in a departure of some key talent and a scrapped sequel. What went wrong with Star Wars Outlaws? A virtual layup in the world of Star Wars stories being a non-Jedi story, simply due to how desperate people have been wanting a game like that. A title that was supposed to be part heist, part criminal adventure RPG? We will find out why Star Wars Outlaws was such a dud on this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or process of dying of a game or company by utilizing a timeline of events, filled with clues, bits of evidence, but most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Let's get to the case, detectives. We have heists to complete that feel about as dangerous and risky as a Disney sing-along. But hey, at least it's Star Wars, right? Wait a minute. The story begins back in 2020, coming off the strength of prior Massive projects, the main developer for this case, such as the Division series, which they largely were responsible for as a subsidiary under gaming giant Ubisoft. Massive started as a smaller developer who would find some success with the RTS I enjoyed too, World in Conflict. Very underrated, I might add, so much so that they would be acquired by Ubisoft post this. The ironic thing is, although Ubisoft was known for hostile takeovers, like when Vivendi tried to hostile take over them, Vivendi Games being a video game publisher and holding company famous for such things, they would actually get reverse yoinked, which is totally random. Massive had been with Ubisoft since 2008, and although they would start as a support studio for Ubisoft to some great success, they would eventually grow to build their own unique IP, and a very successful one at that, The Division. The Division was an online-only looter shooter or open-world RPG, whichever buzzwords you prefer. Both pretty much fit the bill, that managed to sell a whopping 20 million copies, putting Massive completely on the map. And they were out for blood, aka a repeat in that success. Which is why they would notice opportunity brewing, with EA having lost the exclusive rights to make Star Wars games, and pitch Lucasfilm Games in 2020 concerning a new upcoming Star Wars open adventure game idea. Something Ubisoft would confirm the following year, inking a deal with Lucasfilm. The project was set to be led by the creative director and producer on The Division, Julian Gerati, who admitted in an interview that the game would be a narrative-focused open-world game, and that it would be a big departure from The Division. JG, same initials as me, and Massive wanted to flex the muscles of their successful Snowdrop engine too, the engine behind the Division series. This is noteworthy because oftentimes people compare the game in question in this case to Assassin's Creed, when it's actually far more like the Division because of the engine. The announcement was a bit lukewarm for me though, despite being a Star Wars fanboy, self-admitted, but that was because we just got burnt out over like a decade over the Ragtag project, which was like the Amy Hennig heist scoundrels crew type game that was like ultimately cancelled. I somehow didn't think this project, now handled by Ubisoft, was necessarily going to be any better than that because it didn't have as good writers, and I hadn't enjoyed an Assassin's Creed game in a while, not because they're bad, but because they just kind of feel like the same thing over and over again. Others, and myself included, were a bit worried that was the ultimate fate. of a Star Wars Ubisoft game. But I have to admit, part of me really wanted to see this new story-focused open-world game succeed because, well, Star Wars hasn't ever gotten one, really. Ubisoft would formally announce their new Star Wars game in the summer of 2023, dubbing it Star Wars Outlaws, which was set to be an open-world single-player action-adventure game, set in the year between The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi. This is a familiar setting, with titles like Rogue One, Solo, and Andor all being featured in the similar time. The game was very Naughty Dog coded, despite its Ubisoft DNA, as shown in the opening shots upon the gameplay walkthrough hitting the web. Outlaws was also bragging it was the first open-world Star Wars game, largely because the Jedi Survivor / Fallen Order games are considered more like Metroidvania / linear games. But the hype was there early on, especially when Massive's main goal, according to the press release, was cities that would be dense, living, and with lots of activities, which was making the game sound like a real open-world RPG. Like Cyberpunk, but, you know, Star Wars. But then a year had passed, and suddenly Star Wars Outlaws was finding itself just months before launch with very little public playtime available for their upcoming big game. It wasn't a good sign either when GameSpot during their preview in the summer of 2024 would state that they felt that Outlaws felt mediocre with the protagonist who's way too strong, which they explain as a problem because of how easy it seemed to be to just smash through obstacles in the game with a supposed very inexperienced scoundrel who was just learning the ropes. This vastly changes just not how the game plays, but even the tone of the game. When playing Star Wars Outlaws, you start off the game already feeling a lot closer to Han Solo than even Han Solo did in the Solo movies when he was younger. Able to seemingly luck yourself out of like any situation as well as blast your way out too. Han didn't shoot first, I promise guys. But this would be problematic because if Outlaws couldn't convince enough players they were on a journey from the ground up, the gameplay would feel campy and offer nothing new any other IP hasn't already offered in a better setting. Like how in Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed, the combat can kind of be avoided in many cases, where you can only focus on assassinating like the specific targets you have to. Whereas K-Vest, the main character spacer turned scoundrel, seems to be able to be a better shot than just about everyone in Star Wars, while also boasting an origin story which was conflicting with that heavily. It also changes how the tone of the game plays when you go from learning the ropes to easily dispatching of your threats. Frankly speaking, this preview from GameSpot was spot on, no pun intended, for a game that was coming in with a lot of hype especially. Because as I found myself often doing when playing Outlaws myself, you inevitably will compare it to other games similar to it. Problem being, it never seemingly escapes those shadows, as I will detail shortly. Star Wars Outlaws would launch 4 years after its first initial announcement, August 30th, 2024, on all major platforms globally. Star Wars Outlaws had hype brewing all around it, full-page ads and mentions just about everywhere that you could lay your eyes. But despite this, would only manage to score a slightly respectable score given the stature and hype especially, at 75 out of 100 from 89 different critics, still managing to sell 1 million copies within the game's first launch month too. IGN would score the game a 7 out of 10, where they would claim it was a fun intergalactic heist adventure with great exploration, but it's hindered by simple stealth repetitive combat and a few too many bugs at launch. Where they would then hem up about how ironic it was that Kay's ship was named Trailblazer, since not a whole lot of trailblazing was going on in the game, and most of what's been done in the game had already been done before and done better in other open world adventure games. Ouch, but fair. Eurogamer Portugal had a much more negative review, at a 3 out of 5, where they would go as far to call Star Wars Outlaws the kind of AAA experience that gives gaming a bad name. Double ouch. And look, these two critical reviews do a pretty good job of pinning Ubisoft for Massive's new Star Wars Outlaws. But since you guys know how much I love Star Wars and feel opinionated about their games, I had to download Outlaws 2 years removed from its launch and give the game a fresh shot myself, to see for myself. So strap in, detectives. I am a no-life Star Wars fan who has read more Star Wars books and played more Star Wars games than you probably care to know existed, and I genuinely love them. Where to start with Star Wars Outlaws? Well, why didn't I originally play it at launch, despite all of my self-hype? Well, because the project just simply showed nothing exciting feature-wise to me. The best thing about Outlaws is the setting and style of the game. In some ways, it feels almost like a layup, with so little competition there, but in other ways, it wasn't a layup. It was fierce competition, and a competition that Outlaws ultimately lost. When you first load into Outlaws, you get this feeling you're being given exactly what you want. A Star Wars scoundrel adventure that doesn't follow a Jedi or anything Force-related for once. A classic Star Wars gaming experience, really, with the success of titles like Star Wars Dark Forces, Republic Commando, Battlefront, and much more. Hell, even Shadows of the Empire, a classic by the way from 1996, has the exact same premise as this game. Which might confuse you, because if you expected me to say that it was more rare, but when you consider all Star Wars media and how much of it is Jedi or Force related, you can see my point. The premise might not have been that unique, but it was still a very strong one in Outlaws. You play as Kay Vess, a fledgling scoundrel who is just learning how the hard world in Star Wars works, and how they must fight to survive at all costs. Okay, well that's the idea or premise usually in a Star Wars world like that, but it feels like, in this case, a bit more Disney coming-of-age experience-like, which I heard Ubisoft used to describe the game at least once. Look, Kay Vess is charming, in a little sister kind of way, but she doesn't evoke much else beside that for me, and the juxtaposition with her seemingly being a noob, while also being really good at things. I mean, I was playing on Expert, and that's the highest difficulty in the game, and yet I felt like Han Solo in his prime, which makes the gameplay feel conflicted. Again, like GameSpot covered. Is this a stealth game, or an open-world adventure game? And before you answer, I know many of you are going to answer, well, it's a stealth game. And that's because at launch, it very much was, with the majority of the missions having stealth failstates to them like a Splinter Cell game, ironically another Ubisoft game. This would be amended in later changes I learned, which is why it wasn't my experience when I was playing the game, though my experience wasn't much better, as even though I was on the highest difficulty, the game was an absolute breeze for me. In fact, at some points I would cartoonishly just charge in, just to see what would happen, and it felt like I was Boba Fett, where I could easily dispatch a hangar of foes who outgeared me, outnumbered, and even had better weapons than I did. And no, not from like scoundrel foo, think Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, where I'm just using my wit and whatever's around me to like beat my foes. No, I'm just straight blasting. I just started blasting. The combat feels just about as on rails as you can get too, with sometimes even my miss shots somehow like landing to my confusion, as if they were like magnetically attracted to my foes. And in a bizarre design decision, because as Massive would put it in a game interview, they would make Outlaws a non-cover shooter, because they didn't want the game to devolve into just hiding behind cover and blasting away, which would be the go-to way of fighting for a scoundrel, by the way, usually, when not trying to use their wit, like I said, like the Captain Jack Sparrow approach, which wasn't being offered here either, by the way. But here's the thing in Outlaws, you have a dynamic aiming system that effectively allows you to take cover without the game actually registering that you're in cover, which means you get the best of both worlds. You can just third-person cover glitch most foes in the game, and most of them won't even realize you're in cover, blasting them away with your surprisingly effective pea shooter, by the way. But hey, you don't need to exploit that to win any of the gunfights, just charge in and blast away, which was a bummer for me, because the actual game movement isn't half bad. When you don't give a scoundrel any reason to do anything besides just blasting though, they're just going to blast away, like a trooper or a nondescript soldier would. Nothing unique or cool about that really. Did I mention that the game has RDR's quick draw slow time system too? It's not even explained either. That's the crazy part. You can just do it. Because, making an already easy combat even easier, bringing me back to Splinter Cell Conviction, which had a similar trivial combat system made to make you feel like a superhero. Which makes sense in that game, actually, but doesn't in this game at all. Which brings me to the next issue with Star Wars Outlaws, which is just how the game feels like a hodgepodge of other game ideas and designs with no unique features of its own, to stand on its own, which makes it feel like a Frankenstein Ubisoft game more than a unique Star Wars open world adventure. Like sure, you can travel around on a speeder, but the world only takes like 4 minutes to traverse, which is less than the Division did to cross the entire map. So all this hype and talk about Massive being so good at making massive games was kind of just hype. This world is no bigger than any of the other worlds they had created before. So the combat is meh, the stealth is last gen, and the world is okay, just okay. It looks great in some spots, really showcasing a unique scale Star Wars hasn't really seen in gaming yet, let's be honest. And in other shots it feels like a Fallout city, masquerading as an entire planet. And what about the characters, story, and dialogue? You know, my favorite kind of stuff, nerds' favorite stuff. Considering this was a narrative-focused game, that might be the most important part, right? Sadly, nothing offered here is anything you haven't already seen packaged in a different, mostly better format already, whether from the EU, books in the Star Wars universe, or some of the more just expanded stories. Kay Vess was the chance for Star Wars to have a cool female lead, to right the wrongs and drama surrounding Rey, for example. Instead, we're left with another PC who feels more like a Mary Sue than a lovable underdog that you would root for. It's like whoever wrote her backstory and maybe even Rey's and character motivations just hasn't ever experienced poverty, or what it's like to live on the streets. Two things I'm quite familiar with since I grew up on Medicaid. The story has this Disney level of positivity, radiating all around it from the beginning. The most realistic segment being when you meet a random guy on a transport speeder, and he ignores you outright when you try to say hello naively and softly. I will go a step further and say that if you want to experience like K-Vess in HG, and I don't mean regarding the game's poor visuals, which I will cover in a little bit, but I mean like just go watch the Fallout TV series. Seriously, that's K-Vess in HD. You have a main character in it, in Lucy, who is just that, naive and young, fresh out of the vault, and trying to make sense of a world that doesn't match her childhood experiences or realities at all. It's great. She's constantly being taught new lessons because of this naivety, and ultimately is forced to shift and change to grow to thrive on the surface. Oh, and she's not just like a damsel in distress either. She's very competent. Even more competent arguably than K-Vess is. For good reasons, since she was trained to be that way. Compare this to K-Vess and you have a world of difference. K is too perfect and hardly encounters struggle despite not having the same kind of background that Lucy did, which is why her okie dokie attitude, similar to Lucy, doesn't land well here. Not to mention, she's a literal criminal. Did we mention that part besides just the whole buzzword title scoundrel mentioned and Outlaws in the name of the game? K-Vess is a scoundrel trying to make a living, but most of the heists or crimes you commit in the game feel like they were written in a way as to not offend anybody at all. Like they were written by Canadians. Just kidding. But seriously, why is the plot on top of K-Vess just so friendly? Doesn't work if everything in the game is so friendly. It just feels fake and plastic, which matches the big open cities in the game that are filled with massive amounts of empty NPCs with no interactions, no dialogue, and no tasks to speak of in the city. But if the entire tone of something is geared towards one of positivity, why even hide behind the veneer of being a criminal or scoundrel committing crimes? You could have just done a crew narrative-based adventure game, or show, like Firefly, or hell, I don't know, Star Wars? With a name like Outlaws, I would have expected to have been committing crimes, not beating up specifically as advertised thug, gangsters, and Imperials, aka these are bad guys just so you know. Hell, the only rebels you meet in the game, you are forced to ally with, making it seem even more heavy-handed, if anything. If you're calling me an outlaw or a scoundrel, I want to feel like one. This is where I can tell Ubisoft and Massive just massively, no pun intended, misunderstood what makes a scoundrel in the Star Wars universe so cool and impactful. And frankly, many Star Wars fans also seem to misunderstand one of its prime examples, to be fair. Let's talk about Han Solo, or Harrison Ford. Han is not a good guy. At least, he doesn't start that way. When we first meet up with him, he's a criminal who just freshly murdered someone, smuggled contraband, and attempts to scam the main character, Luke. This all happens within the first movie, by the way, and like the first 25 minutes of it. Han then eventually grows to be a likable rogue, a classic archetype, where they're just evil and bad enough to commit crimes and do things that help the good guys, but usually the nice kind of crimes and the ones that make them look good in the process or support the good guys in the process, making them an eventual hero. You know, like the classic archetype, Robin Hood. Sure, Han does make the entire spectrum, but now compare that to K-Vess. It just seems like we're picking up with Han Solo after he's already a good character, when he wasn't even committing crime anymore, which doesn't even fit. But hey, they're different characters, at different parts of their journey, and K has more of that fighting to survive mentality. Too bad they never showed any of that. Which makes it hard for a story of a kid coming out of the ghetto or squalor land here, which I would have personally loved to see as a Star Wars fan since it's representation for me personally and my people. But nothing else really lands in Outlaws. The characters are mostly duds, including the main villain and supporting cast. And the visuals are hotly debated in Outlaws, and to be honest, at first glance I was confused as to why. I thought it looked fine, but after playing through the game I realized that they aged really poorly, and they age even poorlier, if that's even a word, as you play on, because of how bad the game's lip sync and in-game cutscenes are by comparison to the full cinematic ones. I mean, Kay looks different in gameplay, cinematic gameplay, and the cinematics, which is just not good. Especially when her and the rest of the game's visuals just don't look that great to begin with. This is a 2024 game, and it looks comparable to like games from 6 years or more ago, like Red Dead Redemption 2, which is that old. It's obvious there's a lot of inspiration from RDR2, especially given that this game is called Outlaws, but it's like none of the actual good parts of the inspiration were brought over. They just were like, hey, let's make her a gunslinger and have gunslinger parts. And the final kicker for me, the one that made me quit the game ultimately, is just how monotonous every action in the entire game is. Seriously, clock it sometime. Nearly every action in Outlaws takes time, seconds sometimes, and it has this weird delay to it, which means in a single gameplay sequence you could spend as much as like 15 seconds just waiting around for something to progress, or for your character to complete a bunch of actions that take way too much animation delay for some reason. It's like they're intentionally trying to slow you down from playing the game, which felt unintuitive to me and anti-fun. At the end of the day, even with my complaints aside, Outlaws has been rated largely mediocrely as a game, and that's a pretty fair assessment in my book. The problem being I had much higher expectations for such a slam dunk setting and genre, and frankly, for Star Wars games in general. The idea that I have to celebrate them when the gameplay feels like decades expired is just never going to sit right with me, even if I am a fanboy. And that was Star Wars Outlaws for me. It's just Star Wars The Division Creed, or Star Wars Red Dead The Division. And this is all made worse by the fact that the game had a ridiculously large development team that worked on it. According to Ubisoft, they had 600 or more developers working on the game. But if you read the credits on Moby Games, they multiplied that substantially. Which can only beg the question of how much money was even spent on this thing. By my estimates, that had to have been at least 200 million, though likely much more. When you consider all of this extra context, that's why it's hard for me to even get out of bed about Star Wars Outlaws in the end. It's so mediocre, despite having literally everything handed to it. It's like a spoiled rich kid, who still is mediocre. Within just a month, and Ubisoft would already admit that Outlaws had underperformed from their projected sales, something they seem to mostly blame on a fading Star Wars IP and poor scoring, something they would continue to do, which just felt flippant, when this was a dud, and it was your dud. Own it. Post-launch content was promised for Star Wars Outlaws as typical with most AAA games these days, and alongside the promised story packs, which would cost $15 each, would be a number of developer and title updates meant to push the game into a much better state of gameplay and fix many of the game's poor performance issues. I mean, shit, my game was lagging during the cinematics. Title updates 1.2 through 1.3 would read more like beta patches than post patches, with the majority of the fixes they introduced seeming quite trivial, like fixing FOV sliders and map collision. But Title Update 1.3 would address the stealth mechanic failures on missions I mentioned previously, which I already experienced when I played the game, as well as what they were calling improved AI, which makes me horrified to see what the AI was previously. I mean, this AI stops shooting at me whenever I hide behind cover, pretending I disappeared. It's some of the worst AI I've experienced in a Star Wars game ever. Something I did like about the changes though, besides the stealth changes I already covered, were the increased focus on the wanted mechanics in the game, which were sure a ripoff from RDR or GTA, and much worse than those games, but at least it helped feed the idea that you were a criminal on the run. That was honestly the most fun I had playing the game personally, saying the words, entering Imperial space or entering Imperial areas, since it made me actually feel like danger, and like I was a criminal. The dev updates are basically just like ChatGPT renditions of title updates explained out, with a bit of developer rationale sprinkled in. Problem being, it reads like a baby's first feedback session, except this is public. Why are you telling us that you needed to fix the game? We already know why. It's not good, and it's lacking in aspects. The self-flagellation in these posts overloaded my detective senses, and I'm plenty arrogant, trust me. Like them explaining why they removed failed state only stealth missions. Like guys, nobody asked for them in the first place. A scoundrel isn't the same as a stealthy boy or girl or agent or assassin. In fact, usually they aren't that stealthy or use stealth field generators or archetypically speaking in the Star Wars universe. You don't need to tell us why you made the game modern and better, or at least tried. It just felt like they wanted a participation trophy for me. Like Massive was trying to convince Lucasfilm Games or Ubisoft more than themselves or their players. The story packs I aforementioned would begin releasing first November 21st, 2024, starting with the Wildcard story pack, featuring another iconic scoundrel, Lando Calrissian, who by the way, in contrast to K-Vest, tried to sell the main character to the main villain for massive wealth. You know, like a criminal would, and even then he would get redeemed. Anyway, this $15 story pack would feature a new heist mission to infiltrate a high-stakes sabacc tournament, which is actually a pretty cool concept because it also featured you being able to play sabacc, though mostly as a plot device in the mission. Just don't see how you can argue it's worth $5 per hour though, at just 3 hours of gameplay. This feels like something that should have been included in the game to start, to sell the game better anyway. This whole idea of releasing your game in an inferior, content state, knowingly holding off on content in a single-player game that was already lacking in it, and scoring very poorly, it's just annoying, am I right guys? The second story pack would drop May 15, 2025, and although this one was rated more positively than the previous one, as it offered a new area to explore, the Kepi system, and featured a funny classic character returning from the Clone Wars and Rebels cartoon series, Hondo Onaka, the eccentric space pirate who always gets everyone into trouble one way or another, which honestly showed how lacking the cast of characters was for the game, because he's the best character in the game. But although this story was marked as an improvement, it still only offered a paltry 4 to 5 hours of gameplay content, and worse was the ending, if you want to call it that. With all three choices kind of being lackluster really, especially after spending all DLC working towards that particular goal, and if you made the wrong decision at the very end. To be fair though, part of this I think is probably people not being familiar with Hondo, which is that he never pays out or is worth the hassle. It's why people don't work with him. But the ending does happen rather abruptly, with no boss fight and is largely based on dialogue choices, for some reason. Outlaws' final update outside of the soon-to-launch Nintendo Switch 2 version of the game would drop in the summer of 2025. Again, just more bug fixes, which is like, cool, they're still covering the game, but these are the kind of fixes that you would have hoped would have been fixed like the year before the game came out, which just sums up how mid Outlaws felt. Ubisoft CEO would dub Outlaws a failure that same summer, claiming it was in due part due to the controversy surrounding the Star Wars IP, while glossing over the fact that he admitted Massive would launch an unfinished game and then expect a pat on the back after it took them half a year of updates to fix it. It was totally tone deaf, but how do you even know what your tone is anymore when you've been steadily doing the same thing for 10 years straight, even into the arms of potential failure? They're currently billions in debt. And that same thing isn't working anymore, whether with Far Cry, Assassin's Creed, or Outlaws. Last Far Cry 6, compared to the previous one, sold demonstrably less. The last Assassin's Creed sold half the previous one, and Outlaws reportedly only sold about 1 million copies. Ubisoft's time in the sun has been steadily drying up for nearly a decade at this point, after surmounting a lead we never even thought possible, I should add. Showing that eventually the market will run into fatigue with your aging, lacking innovation, similar products, and when they do, boy is that going to hurt, as Ubisoft is finding out. Outlaws would sell so poorly, it would have a reported sequel cancelled even, after it was set to sell nearly 5x as much as it ended up selling, resulting in the death of a series before it even began. The final platform to enjoy Star Wars Outlaws was the newest Nintendo platform, the Nintendo Switch 2, which would experience the game's launch September 4th, 2025. And to be honest, despite this game getting a lot of weird coverage that was like negative, the Nintendo Switch 2 version is honestly pretty good, which makes me kind of suspicious. I mean, it's only like about a year after the game originally came out, and I don't think my PC version looks that different than the Switch version. I guess my main concern is how much was compromised for the PC release and console releases ultimately. It's just a question. While Outlaws sold okay on the Switch, it wasn't impressive enough for them to brag about it, so we know it wasn't that impressive. After a poor performance with Star Wars Outlaws, Ubisoft would be forced to move Massive, their subsidiary video game development company, into what they were calling a process of soft layoffs, which within a few months would result in a number of departures, though most high-profile being the game's creative director, Julian Geraghty, who would go on to work at Battlefield Studios. Interestingly enough, we have no idea what his title is, which could mean that there's another game being worked on by him or led by him, or perhaps the shuffling since the untimely passing of the former studio head Vince Zampella is still ongoing. My read on Julian is, he's talented. Obviously, he has a long track record to back that up, and in interviews I've watched of him, he seems to represent himself quite well. But I will say I don't really think that he wanted to make a Star Wars game. At least I'm not really convinced of that, because his job as the creative director was to convince me of that, by making me feel that through the game, and I just never felt it. No, like I said before, Outlaws felt like it was made by posh kids who only know Star Wars from watching the movies and barely at that, which is just not my kind of fun. The timeline has come to an end, detectives, and we have caught up to recent times as of 2026. No new announcement for future Outlaws content and no future announcement have arisen countering the game's lack of success. No, Outlaws will likely go on to be one of the more forgotten Star Wars titles, though not something Ubisoft so easily can forget, as it was an expensive mistake. A title that sold 5 times worse than they projected, and failed to make any serious mark as a Star Wars first open-world adventure game. So in case you weren't paying attention along the way, what are some of the reasons that Outlaws failed to make a hit, mark, or even a stain? Conflicting design and narrative. Open-world slop. Copy-paste Ubisoft. Are we a scoundrel or are we Bond? Disney kids, criminality? monotonous gameplay, a trivial combat system. I had a conversation with one of my longtime Discord members. Speaking of which, plug, if you haven't joined our Discord yet, you're missing out because it's the fastest and most reliable way to speak to me, happily or angrily or not. Visit our discord.gg/nerdslayer to find a Discord of like-minded gamers to discuss past or future videos, or whatever video gaming topics come up and are circulating at the time. But anyway, plugging aside, I had a conversation with Des, one of our longtime members, and the convo was basically this. How did they fuck this up? How did Ubisoft and Massive blow such a seemingly safe and easy world? I mean, as the opening cinematic was playing, I remember distinctly thinking to myself, this game has to be bad or totally average for me not to like it, with how much of a Star Wars fan I already am and how much was already, just working for it. But despite all that goodwill, and all the cards stacked in the favor of Star Wars Outlaws, like I said, it's just that privileged kid who just squanders every opportunity they got, and in the end, results in mediocrity. But I have to say, thank you to the market forces for making this come true. Because if a game is not good enough, I want the market to reject it outright, and reject it enough and hope that we get something much better in the future. I just wish that the market would have rejected that painfully average Jedi Survivor or Fallen Order series too. But 'tis a story for another time. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Star Wars Outlaws as a game, and why you think it failed as a project. Until the next case, a tag team fighter that was hoping to land a knockout blow to the FGC, and in the end found itself throwing in the towel after just a few months.
Life is motion, not